Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's fascinating program with our special guest from Austria. I'd first like to welcome His Excellency, the Ambassador of Austria, Mr. Wolfgang Oliver Kuchera, who's here today, and of course, Dr. Pervez Hudbay, and the Black Hole team for organizing this. Thank you very much. Today we have our guest who is a musician and ethnomusicologist from Austria with a very interesting story, who's engaged in fascinating work, which we're going to talk about today. Of course, today's session will be conducted in English. In the end of the program, if anyone has questions, you can ask in Urdu also if you want, and we can translate. Let me introduce our guest for today, Dr. Marko Kölbl. Did I pronounce that right? Yes. Dr. Marko Kölbl is Assistant Professor and Chair of the Department of Folk Music Research and Ethnomusicology of the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna. He holds a master's degree in classical piano and a PhD in ethnomusicology, and is specialized in music and dance of minorities and migrant communities. His research covers a wide range of topics, from Croatian laments to gender and sexuality in traditional music, up to his current postdoc project on music from Afghanistan and the refugee experience. He's done extensive fieldwork in Austria, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iran, and Turkey. And as a musician, Marko Kölbl is active in the field of vocal music of the Croatian minority community in Austria as a solo performer and choir leader. So Marko also has a Croatian background, which is why I was also invited by the Black Hole today to conduct this conversation, because I lived 13 years in Croatia myself. So, and I'm also a musician, so we have lots in common. So first, let's start with music. Marko, welcome to the Black Hole. And tell us, because music in Pakistan is, we don't really have music academies in Pakistan. We have one Academy of Performing Arts in Karachi called the National Academy of Performing Arts. And then we have a couple of courses in musicology, for example, in the National College of Arts in Lahore, and in a couple of other places. Otherwise, if you want to study music, you have to find a teacher of the instrument or the vocals, type of vocals you want to train in, and then you study with them. So can you tell us what music education itself looks like in Vienna? How old were you when you started music, and what exactly did you study in university?
Thank you. Thanks for introducing me. Thank you for coming, and it's an honor to be here. Especially talking about this current research of mine in this given situation. Coming back to your question, music education in Austria generally, and specifically in Vienna, which is considered to be the city of music, famously so, is quite institutionalized. There are a lot of opportunities starting from a very young age, not even school age, but even before, which is called elementary music education. And it also is, theoretically, it is quite democratically open to everyone. We have music schools in Vienna, for example, nearly in every district for school kids. And then in the tertiary education sector, we have actually one of the biggest universities in Europe for music and performing arts, with 25 departments. And music education in Austria, I would say, has a quite long standing history as well. Our university, for example, is over 200 years old, but also the other provinces and cities in Austria, they have music universities or conservatories. So music itself is a very prestigious thing to do in Austria, especially Western classical art music. The education is institutionalized, and the job sector as well. There are numerous orchestras, there are numerous possibilities to work in the educational sector. So music is a big part, if not one of the major parts of the Austrian cultural scene.
And what's the difference between a music conservatory and a music university?
Well, tricky question. Actually, it's the same. The university has a little bit more university structure. So our university, for example, was a conservatory before. It then became an academy. Then, out of legal reasons, actually changes in the Austrian law, it became a university. Basically, both of these concepts of institutions, the conservatory and the music university or the music academy, all of these institutions are equivalent to the tertiary education sector. That means universities, and they will train you specifically in music performance. However, our university, since it's a university and not only a conservatory, if I may say so, also has a lot of scholarly courses, but also scholarly or, let's say, scientific, artistic programs. And also other programs like music therapy, music and performance, and dance, and so on.
And does your family have a background in music? Is there anyone else who's a musician? Because that's generally how it works in Pakistan.
Yes.
And what age, how old were you when you started learning?
I would say that's also how it works in Austria. My father is a musician and he studied at the same university as I did. I would argue that there is a high percentage of, let's say, inheriting music to your children, but it's not necessarily it's not mandatory. It's not a hereditary musicianship system. I was 6 years old when I started with the piano. There was just a piano in our home, so it was kind of natural. And we will probably come back to that, but I have two sides: the classical music education, but also the folk music of the Croatian minority, which is my mother's ethnic background. And these two music influences are quite different, I would say.
And you didn't only study music, you started performing music as well. So you got into the music industry also.
Well, yes, during my piano studies, of course, I was performing quite often with the piano. This is part of the job as a student. But I very soon realized that I don't want to stay in classical music. Even though it was a great experience, I learned a lot and I would never want to miss it. The field of classical music is too restricted for me. It is very much related to a specific, maybe also elite concept of culture, and it can be quite exclusionary as well. In order to be able to study classical music in Europe generally, you need parents that are maybe that maybe can provide certain financial resources, but also a certain, well, I would say class background. And that's what kind of attracted me with ethnomusicology, that we deal with a lot of musics where these exclusionary logics are not there. So musics where it's more about participation, community maybe, musics where you don't need an entry ticket to enter the scene, but you're part of it maybe just because music is part of everyday life. And that's what a lot of the musics that ethnomusicologists deal with actually can give.
So after specializing in music and piano, you started studying ethnomusicology. Can you explain to our audiences what ethnomusicology is and what made you get into it?
Very quick, I would say ethnomusicology is the study of music as culture and in culture. So music as a cultural phenomenon. It is often misunderstood as ethnic music studies. Very often it has to do something with it. I would not deny that. And also the beginnings of the discipline are very much rooted also sometimes in colonial understandings of ethnography. And ethnography plays a big role. But the discipline has changed, and nowadays the the definition of the discipline is rather in how we would approach music and not what kind of music. So approaching music as something that is important in people's life, talking to musicians, talking to people of the community, doing so-called ethnographic fieldwork. That means getting to know people, engaging with people, also through their stories and their lives. This would be the core definition, I would say. So I would say the method is actually the thing that defines ethnomusicology. And nowadays it can be anything. There are a lot of ethnomusicologists working on popular music. There are even I would say ethnomusicologists working on specific topics within Western classical art music, but from a ethnographic and maybe a little bit of distant positionality.
Mm-hmm. So what drew you towards ethnomusicology as a musician?
Well, during my piano studies, there were some mandatory classes. I was majorly focused on art and not scholarship. But I attended a course and I was interested in the beginning. But then that's a kind of anecdote I always tell, when the professor was playing a sound recording from the 1960s from the village where my mother comes from, I was kind of mesmerized by that, because I was sitting in this institution, the very prestigious art university, and suddenly the music that was never valued, like every time I would give a piano concert as a kid, this would be a big achievement. The songs were just there, they were not something to perform. Suddenly this was presented as something very special, even more special than what all of you do in this class, like piano and violin and what on. This is something really important. So this kind of changed my perspective. I personally attached great value to these oral and vernacular folk music traditions that I also grew up with. But seeing them in an academic context made me realize not only how important they are, but how much attached I am to them, and that I actually very much wish to know more about it. Because I grew up in Vienna. I was in this village quite often, but I was a little bit, my roots were not exactly where I was. So it was also a way of, getting to know myself a little bit better, probably.
So could you tell us a little more about your roots? So your mother's side of the family belongs to the Burgenland Croatian community, yeah?
Exactly.
Am I pronouncing it right?
Yes.
So what's the background of the Burgenland Croatian community? When did they migrate from Croatia? What's their story?
They migrated from regions that would be today's Croatia or maybe Herzegovina around 1500, so more than 500 years ago, due to the Ottoman Wars. But this region, and also the part of Austria that these villages are in, about 40 Croatian villages, they used to be part of Hungary. So it was actually an internal resettlement happening, not so much, a voluntary migration. And then these settlers, they would then have about 40 villages, nowadays parts of Burgenland, in Austrian province Burgenland, but also Hungary and also Slovakia. And then their language developed independently. Also musical traditions developed with a lot of transcultural influences from Hungary, from, of course, the German-speaking neighbors and so on. And until end of the last millennial, we could say, until the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, the language was really alive. Now, I would say, unfortunately, language competence is vanishing among younger minority members.
Well, I've met second-generation Croatians living abroad who've forgotten their language.
Yes.
So I mean, you've been holding on to it for several generations. So that's quite remarkable.
Yeah. And interestingly, even though the language vanishes, the music is still there. It that's also something we can see in minority studies. Music actually lasts longer than language in these minority
And are there
communities.
particular instruments that are still used amongst the music of this community? Like the tamburica?
Yes, the
or-
tamburica is the main instrument of the community. However, the tamburica was also not an original instrument for this community, because when they arrived, the tamburica was not as important as it became in the 19th century.
So for those who don't know, the tamburica is a small stringed instrument which derives its name from tambur, tambura. So tamburica, like a small tambura.
Yeah.
And it's a stringed instrument which you
Yeah.
you play a lead
It's
melody
a-
on.
Yeah, it's a long-necked lute instrument. So this was actually important beginning of the 20th century and got majorly important in the communities and the villages only after World War II. Even though nowadays people think it's the most ancient and most, community belonging instrument. Before that, it was actually the Hungarian tradition that was really important in instrumental music, a lot of czardas, and also
So some bow instruments?
some violin, clarinet, the typical, I would say, Pannonian banda music ensemble, a bass, probably harmonica, clarinet, accordion, clarinet, and violin. That would be the setup.
So, after studying or during your studies of ethnomusicology and as a musician yourself, you got interested in the music from the East, and you have widely traveled around the East, Turkey, Iran, now Pakistan. So, could you tell us what was it about the Eastern musical tradition that inspired you?
I mean, with my Croatian background, I was initially interested in Southeastern Europe, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, but also other parts of Southeastern Europe. That my PhD was also concerned with this region.
What was your PhD on?
My PhD was on lament, funeral, improvised farewell
Laments, yeah.
Laments.
Yeah.
With the Croatian minority in Austria, but also in Croatia and parts of Herzegovina. It's a very fascinating tradition where women, it's a female tradition, where women would actually be obliged to lament the dead ones, like their husbands, their kids, their relatives, and both improvised music, melodies, and lyrics.
Words.
And it can be very poetic, but it can also be very harsh and real in the situation of saying goodbye to your dear ones.
We have a very, very similar tradition of laments over here. The ban. In Punjab and in other parts of Pakistan, and also it's amongst the women, and they also improvise, and it's also like a wailing and expression of intense grief, but it's also very poetic.
Yeah, whenever I encounter lament traditions of other parts of the world, I'm mesmerized. Yeah, and I think it's very interesting how in various parts of the world with various gender concepts, this is a task that is attributed to women because obviously it is conceived as something that belongs to care work and to reproductive labor. So saying goodbye to the dead ones, taking on the labor of grief, also for your male relatives, obviously is something that we as societies, in plural, in the world, attach to women.
So can you tell us about your travels in the East? Where all have you traveled, and what drew you to those places?
I did not. So this was I would say the region of Southeastern Europe, also musically, still is my main focus. And I didn't make a conscious decision to become a scholar of Eastern musics. Even though I was always drawn to South Asia specifically, but also to Turkey. I mean, there's a big Turkish population in Austria as well. So Turkish music is present, as is Serbian and Croatian and so on. But it wasn't a conscious decision. It was more like in 2015, a lot of people from Afghanistan and Syria came to not only Austria, Europe generally, especially also Germany. And it was a big media debate. It was framed as welcome culture, unlike before and very much unlike after. There was a certain non-intentional freedom of movement going on. We don't have to talk about the political dimension of that, but it was just happening like that. And so a lot of migrants from especially Afghanistan and Syria came to Austria. And since our department has a long-standing history of minority research and migration research, of kind of mapping the musics that come to Austria since the 1980s, actually, we thought it's something we have to do simply. And initially we started as a team of the department. And then eventually I made a lot of friends, a lot of Afghan friends. We started going to concerts, to other events, community events. We started recording, and I just learned a lot about not only the musical culture, but let's say Afghanness as a whole. And because I made friendships, and because I was drawn to it, and because there was a very, I would say, harsh public opinion on this group, I was kind of, the group grew dear to my heart. That's how I would put it, maybe. And then as I got to know about the music, I learned about the music, and the field just expanded. And then, of course, now with the Taliban regaining power and the Taliban music ban, the topic of Afghan music worldwide gained enormous relevance, because if a music is forbidden where it actually belongs to, then the work we do as ethnomusicologists, as music facilitators, maybe as cultural workers, gains relevance.
So before coming to your work on Afghani music in particular, you traveled to Turkey, you traveled to Iran. Was that also to study Afghani music, or was that to study? Okay.
In Turkey, Turkey was something different. I went to Iran, to Mashhad and Tehran specifically, because the Afghan population in Iran was, I must say, very big. And the musical...
And this was which year that you traveled to Iran?
2018.
2018.
Musical life in Mashhad was incredibly rich, but also in Tehran. And there were a lot of possibilities, opportunities, and also a lot of need for Afghan music because of the community. So this was within the frame of the project on Afghan music. Turkey was something different. It was a field trip with Turkish colleagues from mine, from Istanbul, like a little group. And I've got to know a lot about the Black Sea musical traditions, various traditions of the various ethnicities in this region. We actually went up to the Georgian border and then crossed the border as well. And, you know, in this border region, there are a lot of ethnically Georgian communities in the Turkish, like mountainous region. This was an incredibly interesting fieldwork. It was very well organized. I don't speak Turkish, I have to say. Sometimes I was sitting there and just soaking everything in. But that was more a fieldwork experience. Yeah.
So I just also like to share my experiences briefly. I traveled through Iran in the early 90s. I think it was 92, 93, and then 94 again. First time I traveled alone from Istanbul to Islamabad on buses. And then the second and the third time I had Croatian friends with me, and we did this adventure together. And then we stopped in several cities in Iran, in Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz, Tehran, and then of course Zahedan near the Afghan-Pakistan border. And what I was really pleasantly surprised by in Iran was the level of classical music in the country. Not only music, but classical arts. So, for example, when we visited the shrine of the great poet Sheikh Sadi and Sheikh Hafiz Shirazi in Shiraz, Besides, of course, the monument itself being, so beautifully designed and constructed, and lovely gardens around it, and so on, and the level of cleanliness. But besides that, the poetry of that poet saint was available in beautifully printed books in English, in Russian, in Italian, in Spanish, in German. So, you could really get a feel for that poetry. And of course, the level of the exquisite workmanship and the musical instruments. There were several shops of music in Iran. And even though rock and pop music were frowned down upon, especially during in the 80s and 90s, later on it became slightly more liberal and lenient. But the classical tradition was not only allowed, but it was encouraged. And you have some great musicians from Iran, and you have an Iranian tradition of the Philharmonic Orchestra. But in Afghanistan, we saw something totally different. So what do you think this difference is? Because, of course, both come from the Islamic cultural framework. Why do you think this stark difference amongst the way the Iranians, with their Persian heritage, their relationship with music, why is it so different to the Taliban relationship with music? What's your reading of this?
Well, I think there are also historical reasons, of course, especially when we talk about music education, as you mentioned. The Western classical music education during the Shah regime was quite something that we can also see that in Vienna, because a lot of musicians then came to Vienna, and we still have a lot of Iranian students at our university in Western classical art music. So Western classical art music level of Iranian students is quite high. And I think with the political changes, the need for this kind of expertise and excellence in music shifted to Iranian classical music. We also have a lot of Iranian classical music students at our department. It's nearly the biggest group, I would say, after Austrians. And in Afghanistan, we don't have this history of institutionalized music education. Interestingly, there is a connection to Austria. In the 1960s, a so-called Austrian music school was founded in Kabul. The cultural ministry of Afghanistan asked the Austrian government to kind of help in establishing something like that. And back then he wasn't rector. Afterwards, he was rector of our university. He actually opened this school, and a lot of the teachers from our university went to Kabul and were teaching there Western classical art music. Reminiscence of these. This was during
the time when the Americans were there?
No, this was in the 60s.
In the 60s,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then later on, Kabul University Music Department opened, and then in the 2000s, ANIM, Afghan National Institute of Music, but quite late, I would say. So the music education was very much part of hereditary music families. And in the famous Kuche Kharabat, the musicians' quarter of Kabul, not existing nowadays anymore, unfortunately, that was the place where music was transmitted and refined, and also discourse on music happened. Then we have other institutions like Radio Afghanistan, which was very important for also maybe, being a music institution in lack of music education institutions. And only later on the institutions I mentioned came into being. So I think that's one of the major differences. But clearly there is also the classical Iranian music is considered to be a very important form of cultural expression in Iran, even by religious authorities.
Yeah, very much so. But the way I perceive it, and I'd love to have your opinion on this, that when we talk about the Islamic cultural framework or the Islamic cultural tradition, we can identify the Persian tradition, which of course exists not only in Iran, but in parts of Central Asia and in parts of Afghanistan and in parts of Pakistan. And then you have the Turkic, the cultural expression, which is also connected, of course, but with its own, with its own subtle differences. And then you have the Indic cultural expression, because I think these were the last three Islamic civilizations that managed to survive before the period of colonialism and from the break of one's culture. Because before colonialism, there was very much in the Islamic cultural world a tradition of classical arts and high art and music and philosophy and poetry. But when the colonial experience happened, it like sort of violently uprooted people from their culture. And as a result, what we see in Afghanistan today, for example, it's not that it's part of their culture, it's actually the lack of culture that they behave like this. And Pakistan and Afghanistan, of course, are both situated on the cusp of the Indic cultural experience of the Mughal Empire, and then the Safavid civilization in Persia before colonialism. Would you agree to that? What?
Yes, I would agree to that. I would maybe add the Arab, so to say, Muslim music.
Which regions?
Well, based on the Mugam, Makam, and Makam differences, the Arab-speaking countries, let's say, even though of course there are different Maghreb between Maghreb and
North Africa.
Exactly. I agree. I, as a researcher, am still trying to find out the specific, deep arguments for what's happening in Afghanistan, because we find hostile arguments against music in every Islam surroundings, but the way they are manifesting and the way they're also controlled is different. So even in Turkey, we can find, specific voices that would say this is okay, this is not okay. But generally, Turkey has a liberal and very open music industry, especially in pop music and so on. And so I'm still trying to find out the reasonings and the ways of arguing, specifically now with Taliban and the very harsh censorship of music. Because it's something that we can read in books, something that, we can understand the arguments, the words, but I'm still struggling understanding, and I will probably give some explanation for it, my understanding of what really truly lies behind this hostile stance.
Yeah. Well, when anyone tells me that music is haram or forbidden in Islam, I tell them that music is not haram. Being out of tune is haram. So, besura hona haram hai. And because there has been a long tradition in all of the Islamic world, whether it's the Maghreb or the Persian, Turkic, or the Indic, Mughal, there has been a long tradition of music and poetry and instrument making and also I would say that what Sufism, which is today sort of considered as a subculture, was before the colonial age very much part of the mainstream culture.
I would say that the concept of music being haram itself is a big contradiction, because we see that there is this concept, but then at the same time we see that music is an integral part of all Muslim societies and parts of the world. I would say even in Afghanistan, even nowadays, it's an integral part of Afghanness. It's just very much restricted, but you can never get completely rid of it.
So the Taliban have their own anthems also, don't they?
Exactly, yeah. Taliban have the music ban does not relate to all kinds of music. We must also be a little bit maybe cautious with our, I mean, I would say now I have to be cautious with my Western understanding of music, because the concept of music in an Afghan context would differ. For me, an azan is music. For me, a tarana is also music. A naat is music. Everything that still happens in Afghanistan, like especially folk songs accompanied by drums, which is kind of okay. This is very much music to me. So the concept of music also differs. And the word musiki, as I've learned, often is regarded as the music that was kind of coming from outside, or the music, especially the music for entertainment. Mm-hmm. So the concept of music and what we understand with the word of music also differs. That's something we have to keep in mind. But generally,
isn't it true that the tradition of European classical music and a lot of European folk music also has its roots in the Islamic world from the time of what was used to be called the Islamic Golden Age, when, they say that the origins of the guitar come from Arieb, the great the musician from Andalusia.
Big question.
Okay.
Certainly,
okay.
I mean, certainly transcultural influences are at the core of all music traditions. Mm. A lot of people want to see their own music, especially when we speak of classical music traditions, as something very pure and nationally definable. All of the music that we know, especially in the classical sector, but also in the folk music sector, is an outcome of transcultural interrelations. Yeah. So for sure, I'm not so sure. I mean, I wouldn't say that Western art and folk music traditions have their roots somewhere else, because
some of their roots, not
some
of course,
some of their influence. Yes, exactly. Yeah, sure. Yeah. But music will and has been developed everywhere.
Absolutely,
regardless.
Absolutely. But before our session, I was asking you whether it is known where the tradition of breaking the musical scale into 7 notes comes from. Because over here we know that the first time we find it in history was sometime, it was in this book from India, which was called the Natya Shastra, which was compiled somewhere between 300 BC to 300 current era. No one really knows. No one really knows who compiled it. It's attributed to the sage Bharata. But that's where we first have the division of the 7 notes and the names which we still use today, Sa Re Ga Ma Pa Da Ni Sa, which is the equivalent of Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti Do. So it's interesting how across the world, whether one got it from the other, or whether they arrived at it through their own experiences. But why did they decide to divide the scale in 7, for example? Why not 8 or 9 or 5 or whatever? Yeah. And here, because I have Dr. Parvez Hudboy sitting in front of me, I have to mention that on this, Neil deGrasse Tyson has a very interesting theory. And he says that the number 7, which is considered sacred in all ancient cultures across the world, probably comes from the fact that in the ancient times, when people looked up at the stars, when they gazed at the stars, there were 7 bodies that were not stationary, that they could see with the naked eye, which was the sun and the moon, and then the 5 planets that one can see with the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And that's where the names of the week comes from, and that's where the 7 colors come from, possibly. So that is one interpretation, but no one really knows.
Yeah. I mean, a more rational take would be that within an octave, there are only so many possibilities. Of course, there are also scales within an octave with more than 7 tones, totally logically so. But within an octave, 7, that means actually 8 with the octave added,
with the
is a kind of a practical number also to kind of divide this.
Well, it seems practical today because we're used to it, but it could have been 9. Could have been 6.
Yeah. I mean, even if we talk about microtonal scales, not only in Makam systems, but also in other systems, we also see that it's not that often that we would encounter 9 and 6. Yes, we have. I mean, pentatonical scales within
and hexagonic scales in pentatonic. Sure. Okay.
But I'm not a music historian, so that was just
Anyway, sorry for that segue. But coming back to our topic, tell me about your specific work with Afghani migrant musician communities. And here I'd just like to also briefly share an experience when I was living in Croatia also in the early 90s. I came with a Croatian filmmaker friend of mine to Pakistan, and we traveled to Peshawar, where we made a film on the Afghani musicians who this was in the previous Taliban government, and this was at a place in Peshawar called Takal, which was this neighborhood where all of them had settled, and you had a few buildings which were entirely composed of musicians' families. And it was heaven for a musician over there, because like every floor you would have some music going on.
Well, you need to give me this documentary.
I need to first find it, but yes,
find it.
Yes. So, what does your work exactly consist of with Afghan migrant communities? Because those communities that we filmed back then, they all left, except for 1 or 2 who stayed on. We also interviewed Humayun Sakhi, who's one of the best rabab players. Back then, he wasn't well known at all. And his family, his father, I remember. But most of them then left Pakistan. Most of them went to the West to pursue their musical careers. And the few of them that stayed behind, they didn't really pursue their musical careers. Please.
Initially, I was interested in Afghan music presence in Austria. In Vienna, the community was about 5,000 people before 2015, and suddenly it was 50,000. Now it's around 70,000. So it's the biggest Asian community in our country. Our country has only about 9 million inhabitants, so it's quite a big group. And so initially I was actually doing a project called Musical Identifications of Young Refugees. We were interested in the role of music and dance, for that matter, in forced migration, which often is not like a direct thing, but sometimes years, sometimes childhoods on the move. And music obviously proves to be one quite important opportunity to connect with what, and a lot of the people who came to Austria also are unaccompanied young people, so without parents, also living in Turkey, in Iran, in Pakistan. So connecting with the idea of Afghanness that you might have just got with your parents when you left them through music obviously seems very important. And so that was the initial topic. And then also reconnecting with one's own like ideas of belonging, and also relocating, also making sense of where am I now in this new environment, who am I, and these questions, music and dance are incredibly helpful and important. But then we moved on with really studying the musical scene and the musicians that came to Europe and Austria, and the musical gatherings that are happening, and that's something that I was very interested in, the changes that happen, because in Afghanistan, a lot of the stuff that is happening in Vienna now, and I will show you some examples, was not possible. We have Afghan clubbing nights and nightlife themed around Afghan music. Weddings changed a lot. We don't have gender segregated weddings in Austria in the Afghan context. Music changed a lot. All of these pop musicians that work in Europe, they are very well connected. They have an international kind of music production network. So this was then drawing our attention, and we were actually focusing on a very classical ethnomusicological study of music and migration, the music of a specific group within this migrational context.
Would you like to share some of your work and videos?
Mm-hmm. So this is just a quick, it's not a lecture, it's just a few videos I've prepared, some things that might relate specifically to today's topic. So we've talked about the changes, political changes in Afghanistan in 2021. This picture actually, I think, is in the mind of a lot of you and us in the West. This picture of people falling from the planes was very much sensationalized as well, but it also drastically showed what happened. And we see that also in Afghanistan, it was obviously processed through the art of carpet weaving. And since the Taliban came into power in 2021, the Taliban music ban, which was already between 1996 and 2001 during the first Taliban regime, started again. It was something that most Afghan music scholars could not even think of, and then suddenly it was there again. It is, without question, the most radical form and extreme form of music censorship in the world. And it entails making music, playing instruments, keeping musical instruments, as well as making musical instruments, keeping musical recordings. This has become a little bit tricky with online and smartphones, but listening to music in TV and radio, and of course this also entails dancing. And Taliban are, in the beginning they said they would actually like to make people understand that they should refrain from these things, but eventually they actually showed that they're really pursuing they're really doing stuff to show how music and music-related activities will be punished. For example, burning of instruments and loudspeakers, but also bragging about the number, for example, of destroyed instruments, especially the Taliban's Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, who is responsible for this. Also, okay, yes, thanks. Also, so that's where making press releases like this one, but also circulating videos like this one. I'll go on, but circulating videos on social media is quite an important tool. Also, for example, here the arrest of singer Javad Nazari. Also shaming attendees. And not least, or even killing musicians. Like a few weeks, actually, if not days after the Taliban takeover, Farab Andarabi, a folk singer, was killed. Which also, I mean, there was a huge international outcry then, and now it's a little bit forgotten. And I would like to frame that also as a form of terrorist exceptionalism, because if we ask ourselves, what is the actual goal of all of that? Of course, you know, there is something like religiously, morally, and culturally explained reasons, but also Taliban obviously managed to create an image of themselves that is in distance, in very clear distance to everything that's modern or progressive. And so I think the Taliban music ban is also a way of kind of shaping a certain self-image, especially, but not only, in relation to the West, but also inside the country. And that's something I would frame terrorist as exceptionalism, because it just gives another additional aspect to how they actually already managed to make their image very clear. Bilal Asifi, who was working in Afghan National Institute of Music, calls what happens a musical genocide. The word genocide is a word that we've discussed a lot during the last years here. It's used metaphorically, and it's definitely something very accurate, I would say. And he also shared with us in this event that we had in our university in 2023, what happened to his institution, the Afghan National Institute of Music.
First, I want to show what happened to Afghanistan National Institute of Music. As you can see on the picture, the door of Afghanistan National Institute of Music, this was the door where I personally think that inside this door there was a freedom during when we was in Afghanistan. There was a place where every kid, girls, boys, were living in a free environment, learning music. It was a very happy place inside these doors. But unfortunately, right now, you can see the picture of Haqqani is hanged on the door of Anim. And unfortunately, they destroyed many of our instruments, as you can see, sitar, piano, and many other instruments they unfortunately destroyed. You can see our offices, what they did with our offices. They collect all our documents, important data that was stacked in Afghanistan, and I don't know what happened currently with those documents and data that was left behind in Afghanistan.
So Afghan National Institute of Music, here you can see a Talib guard in front of the Anim entrance. It of course was forcefully closed. However, there was, talking about Exile, there was a kind of an evacuation by the Portuguese government. So most of the teachers and most of the students could go to Portugal. However, in Portugal, and I've been there 3 years ago, in Portugal, the situation then developed not very in a very good direction, because there wasn't a real plan, to be honest. Students had to live in various refugee camps around the country. It was not really possible to continue the music education, and that was actually the initial plan. For the other important institution, the Kabul University Fine Arts Faculty Music Department, there was a rescue program of the German government. Back then it was Angela Merkel, the chancellor, and so a lot of teachers of Kabul University Music Department could go to Germany in one of these famous planes with the lists of evacuation lists, but not the students. And so in our university, we actually created a program for the students of this institution. We accepted numbers are not high enough, in my opinion, but it is at least something. 4 students 2 years ago, and then another 6 students this year, which is a huge undertaking in terms of student residence permits and so on, and also financially scholarships are needed and so on. But it is, doing this kind of research, I feel there is also an obligation to have some kind of political effects and some kind of, engagement or applyment. So that would be the music education institutions, and then maybe just to close this, also making instruments is very much affected by the music ban, in order to come back to our discussion, all of that, this situation led to a mass exodus of Afghan musicians to mainly 4 centers of Afghan music practice, which would be Pakistan, especially Peshawar, Iran, especially Mashhad, but also Tehran. Europe, these countries are the ones with the biggest communities: Germany, Austria, Sweden, UK. And in the US, it's the Bay Area in California. So where in first Taliban era and also now in 2021, Pakistan and Iran were deemed the important centers for Afghan music, whereas Europe and the US were additional possibilities for maybe financially affluent musicians. Now the situation is a little bit tricky in both of these countries, as we know. Before the war in Iran, also Iran expelled up to 1.5 million Afghans, and I don't have to explain to you here in this audience how the situation in Pakistan looks like. And these are the voices on this situation. This is the former head. No, this is the head, I would say, of the former music department. He's still the head, if that department would exist. And his name is Wahid Sagar. And he says his concern regarding the music department, his concern is about the future of Afghanistan's music. Of course, no one can stop the music. Music is all over the world. We have a lot of Afghans that are living in European countries and the USA, and they are active, they produce music, they record music, they are singing, playing. But regarding academic music, research on music, we don't have any particular space and location and opportunity to do the research on the music of Afghanistan, to do research on the music history of Afghanistan, on Afghan music theory. And my concern is about the fate of the music department. So a very young, as we were talking, a very young history of Afghan music education was completely destroyed again. And Fazila Zamir, she was studying in Anim and in Kabul University, also points out to the specific situation of female musicians, because the years between Taliban 1 and Taliban 2 were actually the years where women in music were slowly accepted, at least in the educational sector. Slow steps, but it was happening. And she says that Taliban have banned women from education, work, and participating in artistic activities such as music. This has put women's music in Afghanistan on hold, and women engaging in this field face serious danger. Since August 2021, many artists have been able to leave Afghanistan, but they have not been able to return to their normal lives. The female musicians that I know are living in various countries, but they are still unable to engage in artistic activities. They have been forced to distance themselves from music, education, and performance due to living in camps and shared rooms and abundance of musical instruments. Some of them are still living in Afghanistan in bad conditions. They're hiding in their houses. I will just quickly show a few snippets of Austrian music practice in Afghan music practice in Austria, in Vienna, as I told you. I've mentioned clubbings, and
that's what the Taliban was scared of.
Yes, probably. But that's something that even before 2021 was not common in Kabul. Maybe in the underground, but it was not a common cultural activity. It has became a cultural activity throughout Europe. These Afghan club nights are really popular and important. And since they are mostly dominated by young men, there is another trend that we can see in a lot of European cities to organize these kind of nights specifically for women. So women only are allowed to enter, and so they also don't need to wear modest outfits. And then I will just show you how pop music production might look like in Austria, using the Austrian Alps as a kind of Hindu Kush. Yeah. This
دشمه وطنا قربان دشمه وطنا پشت وطن دلکم زار است پشت وطن دلکم زار است مرا با کابل ببره.
So this is Masi Shut Up, one of the, I think we can stop, one of the first singers I interviewed, and that we are, I followed his artistic development for a long time. This was a song he actually produced after 2021, August 2021. It's about Kabul and about homeland. And one more, this was in Iran. Unfortunately, the video is not working, but this was also a very, very mesmerizing situation, and really wonderful recordings that I cannot play to you now. But since both of the countries, Pakistan and Iran, the countries that were actually the real harbors for music practice and music education, since they have become unsecure for Afghans, we now face, and that's maybe something we can talk about, a situation where actually the places that used to be the safe places during the first Taliban have become unsafe places. So now we have to ask, where actually should Afghan musicians go? It's not easy to go to Europe and to the US or to North America. And also the circumstances in the West for Afghan music production and Afghan music, let's say, practice are very specific. There's not a lot of infrastructure backing them up, but there, at least there is no legal repercussion. So I would like to show with you, to end this, a video that we just made yesterday. A video that we just made yesterday in Peshawar. Umer was so helpful to accompany me for my fieldwork, and it's sad that we cannot show the faces of these nice young boys, 117, 121, coming from musicians' families. Their parents, actually, their fathers, both of their fathers had to go to Peshawar during the first Taliban regime. So they have some kind of déjà vu now with their children, because they were the same age back then. We don't want to show the faces because this is going to stay online. And you know that most of the musicians from Afghanistan now in Pakistan are not documented, so they face deportation. But the musical talent and the excellency that we found is really incredible. And it just leaves me speechless, or a little bit sad as well, to think about how these young people are not able to get education because they cannot go to school as well, because that would also be risky. But also are not really able to make something out of the art that they have become specialists in, to perform what actually would be, you know, the natural setting of this music. Maybe you can play it now. Those of you familiar with this tradition know that this was a 30-minute set. This is just a very small snippet out of it. So that would be my little impulse, and we can go on with the discussion now.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Marko. And I'd like to add over here that it's such a tragedy about the musicians and the cultural practitioners from Afghanistan. And I lay the blame squarely on the great games being played by colonial powers, and and the initial funding for the Mujahideen in Pakistan during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union and everything. But having said all that, after, of course, placing the blame squarely on the shoulders of the colonial powers, which I still do, but having said that, I think that it's up to us also now to take hold of this heritage, because this is our heritage. If we claim to belong to the Islamic cultural sphere of influence, well, this is what our culture is then. Yes, it's from our neighboring country, but it's very, very deeply connected with Pakistan's culture today. And that's why I think it's a real tragedy that this blanket deportation of Afghani nationals is happening in Pakistan. I understand the economic and the security concerns, especially in today's world, but surely there must be, we can come up with a mechanism of discerning which Afghan nationals are good musicians, and surely we can use them in our develop academies around them, develop schools around them, not deport them, because then we're actually playing into the designs of the colonial powers. That's what Israel wants to do. It wants to eradicate the culture of all the countries around it, and if we also start deporting the cultural practitioners, then we're supporting that agenda. So I think it's really important for us in Pakistan. And I don't know whether in Iran do they have a blanket deportation of Afghani nationals, or can musicians in Iran find some possibilities to stay on there?
Also, musicians were affected quite heavily, and now with the war, a lot of musicians are actually, even people with student visa are actually going voluntarily because out of safety reasons. So the war has actually added to the quite complex and not really easy situation that was there before. But I agree exactly with what you said, and thank you for saying that, because it's not my place to sit here and talk about how Pakistani policies should be made or not be made. I can just say from a human rights perspective and from the perspective of cultural rights specifically, and artistic freedom, which I hope we could claim is something universal. I hope it is very, very sad to watch. And it leaves me with the question of what kind of strategies we could come up. I mean, I know there are some, especially UNESCO-related, discussions happening, but it's not a huge number.
That's right.
The professional musicians in Peshawar, it's a number of 300 people that need urgent protection, because they cannot now go on with their music practice and with their music education and transmission, because they are afraid to leave their home. They are afraid to go somewhere else.
Well, about 4 years ago, I was involved in producing this film, which is available on YouTube, which I would also recommend to you to watch whenever you get the time, called Indus Blues. And it's about the folk instruments from Pakistan that are endangered, in danger of dying out, and the craftsmen who make them, and in some instances now there are no craftsmen left to make them. For example, we have a folk instrument called the sarinda from KP province, and now there is no craftsman who makes the sarinda anymore, because you've got one last surviving master of the sarinda left. So we see that happening even with our own musicians over here. And if there are, you say, 200 or 300 maybe Afghani musicians, there are maybe 2,000 or 3,000 Pakistani musicians who also need protection and who also need some sort of state support. And I would like your opinion on this, because I feel that that classical music and heritage music, roots music, should not be left to the devices of the free market. You cannot expect classical music to compete with pop music. If in Europe, if the state had not supported the classical arts of ballet and philharmonic orchestras and so on, there's no way they could have survived. So over here, I think that it's really important for us in Pakistan to understand that in matters of culture and education, the state has to take on a role besides just giving it all to the private, to the free market and saying, okay, it's a business, whoever survives, survives. What's your opinion on this?
Maybe just a small addition to the number of 300. That would be maybe the number of, the real creme de la creme, maybe. There are way more musicians, Afghan musicians in Pakistan in need of help, way more, because how we will, also a music student, someone who is still learning or not yet an expert needs to be protected. Just that would be one addition. But coming back to your question, well, classical music, Western classical art music and ballet, for example, Western classical dance traditions, they are also part of the market. It's a huge market, actually. They're part of a huge business, but they're also backed up by the state. The big houses, they are very much, they receive very high funds, cultural funds. However, there are other roots music, it's a nice term. There are other roots musics in Europe that are not getting this attention, especially folk music traditions. So as an ethnomusicologist, I said before that, we don't care about which kind of music, but a lot of ethnomusicologists are dealing with folk music or traditional music. And traditional music, in comparison to classical music, is often regarded as less complex, less important, less blah, 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 because it's something that the masses do, even though now the masses are not doing that in Europe. Folk music is a very specific thing that only a few people still do in Europe. But it's something that does not get the attention. There is some cultural, maybe like safeguarding or folk culture, especially in the provinces. They might have some programs, but it's not a large scale thing. And the importance of roots musics or folk music is gradually diminishing in Europe. But for the Pakistani context, you might know better. But I totally agree. I mean, the arts need support and structural support by the state everywhere, and regardless the art. That's what I would say. So yes, classical music. Often classical traditions are very much connected to a kind of a nation image of what's important, but also pop music sometimes needs funding. In Austria, we can say Austrian pop music production is not very big, and for a long time people would not dare to sing in German. So there is, it's I would say regardless, it's also depending on where you are in the world, but regardless the style and the genre, there must be some kind of system, because all of these musics are important to a certain group of people.
Have you had the opportunity to, or have you even before coming here to delve into the Pakistani traditions of music or classical and folk music from this part of the world, besides Afghani music?
Yes. I mean, it was, of course, part of the research I had to do before coming here. Even though that's not my research topic, I wanted to know what's going on. And I was, I'm actually quite drawn to all of the, let's say, for example, my colleagues' presentations in conferences that deal with South Asia. So since now I would consider myself an Afghan music scholar, it's also kind of a necessity to be, to know from, the whole, let's say, subcontinent. But I would not say that I'm in any way someone who could claim some kind of expert status. And I also, I'm doing research on Afghan music traditions here, but whenever I encounter something that's genuinely Pakistani, of course I'd be interested in it, and then I will also record it. I will also bring it back to our archive, and it's part of the things I hope to learn here.
Before moving on to some practical demonstration of music, I think it would be a good time to take questions from the audiences. If anyone has a question for Marko, please. आप उर्दू में भी पूछ सकते हैं अगर आप चाहें.
Thank you for a very informative talk. And I'd like to know, in your research of Afghan music over there in Austria and also here now in Pakistan and in Iran, what was the most surprising thing for you as a European? And what do you think would be the most surprising fact for us who live in the subcontinent related to Afghan music or the culture of the Afghan music?
I think the most surprising thing would depend on where. So I guess the most surprising thing in Europe and in Vienna specifically is what changed and how fast it changed. Because these clubbings, for example, they were not there in 2015. In 2015, I actually only encountered very small gatherings, privately organized, maybe similar to here and to Afghanistan. And after a year, they managed to not only come up with the concept of what they are doing, but also to get all the infrastructure, making use of what's existing from previous migrant communities, especially Turkish discotheques. They are very important for them. And to set up an own system of music entertainment nightlife. And since, people from Kabul will probably know better, but since I believe that this kind of nightlife, if it happened in Kabul, it was only available for a very small amount of people. It's something interesting because it is a transcultural interrelation of because it's only Afghan pop music played there, but the system and the venue and the logics of going out at night is actually something they have seen in the surroundings. And sadly, but also surprising, or not that surprising, it was also necessary because a lot of Afghans would be stopped by the bouncers in the clubs because they had a no Afghan policy. So that's a very surprising but also interesting development. For here, I'm still, I'm here for maybe 1/4 of my whole stay. The last 2 days were definitely surprising as well, but also really, really fulfilling. Given the fact that, what surprised me, I knew that in Pakistan, the situation is not easy, but I've seen the cars, the hunting that is taking place in a way, it's a real persecution. This was, in a negative sense, very surprising to me because, we've talked a lot about the topic, so you know how it makes me feel. And in Peshawar as well, just someone we met yesterday actually was late because of the police. But in Peshawar, obviously, there were ways, something that in Islamabad would not be possible, to bribe yourself out of it. But, all of these observations, they are surprising and they are also telling, and they are also, I think they are important. This is important knowledge that we can register right now in this particular moment.
I don't have a question for you, Marko, but I have a little comment on what Arieb said. I would have been a bit happier if you had said that the weakness of music culture in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, owes 60% to colonialism or 70%. or maybe even 40%, who knows. But the fact is that colonialism came to all of India. Hindu culture seems to have survived it very well. Muslim culture has had great difficulty with it. And in fact, if we look at the heartland of Muslim origin, Saudi Arabia, under the Wahhabis, who knew Islam like nobody else, well, yeah, I know there are deviants from Wahhabism and the adherents of Wahhabism, but music did not exist there. What existed in pre-Islamic Arabia was a far richer musical culture than after Islam. So far, the little that I know about it. And that goes for also literature as well, and poetry.
I would beg to differ as far as music is concerned. During the time of the Prophet and afterwards, Arabia had several centers of music, and there was Abu Misja, who is considered the father of Arabic music. There was Azhar, I'm forgetting her name, something, who used to have her own musical mehfil. She used to run her own mehfil because women at that time in Arabia used to have establishments where they would perform live music and poetry. So I would argue that arts and culture and music was very much a part of early Islamic culture before the loss of culture came with the Wahhabi thought. And that culture, I would also argue, took root in Maghrib, in Baghdad, in, of course, Andalusia, in India, in the Persian regions. So right now I'm working on a book about the musical history of Pakistan, and one of the sections of the book has to do with the music and culture that developed when the Islamic sphere of culture came and met with the Indian sphere of culture, and that resulted in a renaissance, really, which Amir Khusro, for example, exemplifies, and the Gharanas. And another interesting thing that I discovered was that the classical music of India, which was called Marga Sangeet. So there was Desi Sangeet and Marga Sangeet. And Marga Sangeet was the classical tradition which comes from the Natya Shastra and the Jatis, which later evolved into the Thats and the Rags. And that culture had been confined to temples and to Vedic sacrifices. It was the Muslim influence or the influence of the cultures that came together with Islam. Of course, I'm not saying it's all connected with religion, but it's the culture that came with the coming of the Islamic invaders and settlers, that the court patronage of music started happening in India. Before that, there wasn't really a tradition of courts having great groups of musicians. It was more, as I said, it was the temples. So it was the Islamic influence here that brought out that classical music and patronized it on that level, which again resulted in Amir Khusro, and then later the Mughals and Mian Tansen, and who himself came from a Hindu background, but it didn't matter because there was this synthesis of cultures. So I would still stick to my guns and say that Saudi Arabia is a terrible example of Islamic culture, because Saudi Arabia is an artificially created country, again, by the colonial powers.
Yes, but syncretism has been bitterly resisted as well. And it has had very palpable effects. Not in India, which is under largely Hindu rule, but it has huge effects here. So which is the truer Islam, I don't know. you'll have to argue this out with some religious scholar who knows what he's talking about, and then you can argue with him. But there's also been all this argument that, so you asked Marko whether musical instruments had been invented by the Muslims. Well, it's commonly believed that all science was invented by Muslims as well, which unfortunately does not make sense.
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
Marko, I wanted to ask you about the Afghan musicians that you mentioned in Vienna. Are they able to survive by the music alone, or is it something that they do on the side? So have they progressed to making a career out of it and a living out of it? Of course, not all, but some.
Some, partly yes. I would first say that there is a scene and a demand. There are weddings taking place, a lot of concerts being organized. Also, Austrian, Afghan musicians based in Austria will travel to other countries for gigs. So depending on their popularity, yes, but most of the musicians, especially, it's changing now. Maybe they were able to like create a brand, especially in pop music. But most of the musicians were actually working, and it's tricky because these musicians, they are on asylum. So in the beginning of the asylum process, often you are not allowed to work actually officially. So there's also the concept of musical labor in relation to work permits and so on is tricky, because it's of course not, it's labor that you might also be able to do, but maybe not officially. But a lot of the people I spoke to and I interviewed were working in supermarkets, in these kinds of jobs. Even people who are well known. I've interviewed a singer and his girlfriend. Girlfriend is also Afghan. She was born in Vienna because her parents left already in the Soviet times. She went to the supermarket, and then she thought, well, the cashier, somehow I know him. I don't know, do I know him? Then she realized it was someone who got second place in Afghan Star, the singing competition. And he quickly Googled the person, and then because she explained it in such a nice way, the story, like this love story, then she asked him, are you the singer? So his name is Harun Andeshwar. And then, so we see that even people who were able to live from music in Afghanistan before 2021, actually these musicians I talk about, they also came before in 2015, 16. So even singers who were able to live, they would have difficulties. But now the network and the system and the infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure has grown that much that a few of them are able actually. And some of them, especially the ones who, also internationally, also in London, for example, I've done some interviews. Those who are kind of refraining from the Afghan pop standards, like for an Afghan audience, and kind of directing their work towards an European audience, something like world music audience, we might call it. So maybe also fusioning their music with jazz or with other ethnically defined musics. So those who know how to cater the demands of an European audience, they can live from it very well, because they will be invited to world music festivals all over the world actually. And they will not be dependent on an Afghan audience, which most of the time is not that financially fluent, and there will be some difficulties. But of course, then again, there is a lot of demand for weddings, for parties, and so on, for community internal events.
Well, I have two comments. So first one, Arieb, आपने कहा कि म्यूजिक जो है वो हराम नहीं है, बेसुरा जो है वो हराम है. तो मेरा उस पे कमेंट है कि बेसुरे को मकरूह कर लें, बेताले को हराम कर दें. So my sense,
Totally agreed.
Thank you. I knew. And second comment that spending like 2 days with Marko and by meeting the young musicians there, the young boys, I can say one thing surely, that beside of all the problems, we are discussing here, I can say one thing, that Afghan musician and Afghan music is in safe hands now. Because the new generation, they are ready for next 30 years. They are very well, like Rubab and the tabla. I mean, we had an event last night, and the music is in safe hands, maybe for another 30 to 50 years.
And also wherever they go, wherever life takes them, they will carry their music with them. The music is in safe hands. We will be all the more poorer by losing that music.
I totally agree, and this is also due to the fact that music you can actually not forbid. It's not really easy to forbid it. It lives in your mind, even though if you're in Afghanistan, you know, you can still think of music. You can still maybe find ways of humming songs, of well, touching your instrument is already dangerous, but it's not so easy to get rid of a whole music tradition, especially if the population is as big as the Afghan population. And maybe one thing to add to Umer's comment: the joy of these musicians and the hardships are there, yes, but still life goes on, and the joy of making music and the proudness, also being proud of this specific Afghan defined tradition. That's also something that might, to end maybe on a positive note, that might give us kind of encouragement and have some visions of a positive future.
Thank you so much, Marko. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sorry. Please go on.
I have a question. How do you compare the music censorship with other arts, the censorship of other arts in Afghanistan?
That's an excellent question that I'm afraid I'm not too knowledgeable to answer. I just know that all the other arts are also kind of in trouble. But what I can tell you from my students' experiences, the students from Kabul University, the other departments have not been closed. The film department is on, the theater department is on. They were just like, well, Taliban, of course, influences what's happening there, so in the theater department, the music department students would normally play. Now they don't, because there are no students left. But also the theater, the drama has to be without music now. So changes in the art forms are happening, but the art forms are still existing because they're also needed. You also need, graphic designers. You will need, all of these artistic jobs. And even Taliban even needs musicians, because the Taliban taranas, the Taliban chants, the propaganda songs, who should compose them? And actually two of the students that we have in Vienna now, they were asked they actually had to reopen the department to Tarana department, and then a Talib came and he asked them to teach the Talibs how to compose taranas, because no one knows, because all the musicians they were just getting rid of them. And so this is the hypocrisy that we're seeing. I mean, there is music going on, taranas, nats, and also charbeti music. So there is still stuff going on, and you also need some competence for that. But coming back to your question, I think music is most affected, but art as a concept is also affected. So, artist is not something Taliban would kind of champion for.
Thank you so much, Marko, for that fascinating discussion. And now, would you like to sing something first? And could you also explain to the audience what it is that we're going to do?
Since I had the privilege to meet someone who is actually fluent in Croatian, but also knows about, let's say, Southeastern European music traditions, we were searching for something that combines us, and both of us are very much fans of a specific urban song genre from Bosnia called Sevdalinka, and it might be also we could even connect it to our topic, because the first project that we have with students coming to our university was actually with Bosnian refugees during the Bosnian War in the 1990s. So Also then, I mean, there was no music censorship happening, but the city of Sarajevo was under siege. It was bombarded. It was really tricky for people in Sarajevo. And a lot of these refugees continued their music practice in exile. Similar story. And especially the genre of sevdalinka, which is very much, a very melancholic genre. It's connected to the cities. And it is on the, let's say, interaction between folk music and classical or art music in an urban context. In exile and in diaspora, this was quite important because the concept, singing about the city is if you had to leave the city, it's a very direct way of expressing your emotions.
So shall we start with this Sevdak song, Nesilazi Sachardaka? So it's the first time I'm playing it. I just got the chord, so I'll try my best.
In 7?
7.
Nesilazi Sachardaka I ne pitaj gdje sam bio. Zašto su mi oči plačne, zbog čega sam suze lio. Zašto su mi oči plačne, zbog čega sam suze lio. Stajao sam kraj mezara I umrlu majku zvao. Nosio joj dar od srca, ali joj ga nisam dao. Nosio joj dar od srca, ali joj ga nisam dao. Ne klepeći na nulama, kad si laziš sa čardaka. Sve pomislim, moja draga, da si lazi stara majka. Sve pomislim, moja draga, da si lazi stara majka.
Shall we do Kadia Pojo? Now Benbashu. Here's another Sevdak song from Sarajevo, from this old quarter of Sarajevo called Benbasha. And Benbasha was a quarter of Sarajevo where actually it was a melting pot, because Bosnia, before the breakup of Yugoslavia, used to be a melting pot of cultures. And in Sarajevo, on this one street, Baš Čašija, you find the Muslim mosque, the Begova Jamia, and you find the Orthodox church, and you find a Jewish synagogue, and a little to the distance you also find a Catholic cathedral. Benbasha was also a place where there was a lot of different influence from the Muslim part and from the Sephardic Jewish part, and so Sevdak really emerged as a mixture of all of that.
Sevda, generally the genre of Sevda is so compelling because of this interaction of Muslim and Southeastern European folk music traditions.
Kadia pojoch na bembashu na vodu ja povedo bielojanie za sobą. Ja povedo bielojanie za sobą. Sve djevojke, membašanke, na kapi stajaju. Samo moja mila draga, nade mirli penđeru. Samo moja mila draga, nade mirli penđeru. Ja joj reko, dobro večer, dobro večer, dilberče. Ja na meni doj do večer, dilberče. Na meni doj do večer, dilberče. And the last verse. Ja te vodom isto večer, već ja odo sutradan. Ali moja mila draga, za drugog se udala. Ali moja mila draga, za drugog se udala. So that's the song where this man falls for a woman who's standing behind a gilded window, and she says, "Come to meet me in the evening." But he doesn't go in the evening, he goes the next day, but she's already married by then. Istanbul? Okay. So, this is a really interesting song from Bosnia, and it talks about the death of the Ottoman Pasha. Yeah, one. U Stambolu na Bosforu bolan paša leži. Duša mu je na umoru, crnoj zemlji teži. Molitva je njemu sveta, dok mu ezin s minareta u
Uči nasav glas. Allah illallah, selam aleikum. Allah illallah, selam aleikum.
Govorite mi službenici, što služite harem, neka svaki od vas uzme jednu ženu barem. Iz oka mu suze okanu, pa na minder mrtva panu, stari musliman. Allah illallah, selam aleikum. Allah illallah, selam aleikum. Kad je čula pašinica za tu tužnu vijest, da se paša zaselio na ahiret svijet, iz oka joj suza kanu, pa na minder mrtva panu, ljubav pašina. Allah illallah, selam aleikum. Allah illallah, selam aleikum. Thank you. So that was, that's about how the old Pasha is dying and all his courtiers are standing around him. And he's saying, you know, my faithful courtiers, now that I go, please, you know, take a woman each from my harem. And and his wife comes and she is shedding a tear that the old Muslim is now on his deathbed. So that's so this, of course, song comes from the Ottoman tradition as well, which was very much part of the Bosnian makeup. Thank you so much, Dr. Marko. Your surname, how to pronounce it?
Kölbl.
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 Yeah. Dr. Marko Kölbl. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
नहीं अभी आ जा नहीं अभी क्या इस पे अच्छा they want me to sing a little something क्या सुनाएं So here's a ghazal from in Rag Malkos, which is a pentatonic scale. Sa ka sa ga ma ga sa sa ga ma dha ni dha ma ga sa ga ma dha ni Dani sa ga sa ni dha ma ga sa. प्यार नहीं है सुर से जिसको, प्यार नहीं है सुर से जिसको, वो मूर्ख इंसान नहीं। प्यार नहीं है सुर से जिसको. So he says, he who does not have love for music is not human. Music is what makes us human. Music is what connects us to the divine. Sur insan bana sorry. Sur insan bana deta hai, सुर इंसान बना देता है, सुर रहमान मिला देता है, सुर भगवान मिला देता है, सुर की आग में जलने वाले परवाने नादान नहीं। प्यार नहीं है सुर से जिसको. And then he says, if there was no music in the world, nobody would be anybody's friend. So we owe this all to the 7 notes that the world, that creation is, that it exists. जग में अगर संगीत ना होता, जग में अगर संगीत ना होता, कोई किसी का मीत न होता, कोई किसी का मीत न होता. ये एहसान है 7 सुरों का के दुनिया वीरान नहीं. प्यार नहीं है सुर से जिसको, वो मूर्ख इंसान नहीं. प्यार नहीं है, प्यार नहीं है, प्यार नहीं है सुर से जिसको.